The letter had promised a modest homestead and a hard-working widower seeking companionship on the Nebraska frontier. What Sarah Elizabeth Montgomery found instead was an abandoned cave carved into a hillside, 6 silent children with hollow eyes, and a mystery that would test every ounce of strength she possessed. Sometimes the greatest journeys begin not with what we expect to find, but with what finds us when we're brave enough to look beyond the surface. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. October wind cut across the Nebraska plains like a knife, sending tumbleweeds dancing past the rickety stagecoach as it lurched to a halt outside the settlement of Millbrook. Sarah Elizabeth Montgomery clutched her worn carpetbag closer to her chest, her gray eyes scanning the desolate collection of weathered buildings that barely qualified as a town. After 3 days of bone-jarring travel from Chicago, she had arrived at what was supposed to be her new beginning. At 28, Sarah carried herself with the quiet dignity of a woman who had learned to navigate the world alone. Her auburn hair was pinned in a practical bun beneath a modest blue bonnet, and her traveling dress, though well-mended, spoke of better times before her father's debts had consumed their family's comfortable life. The death of her parents in a typhoid epidemic the previous winter had left her with nothing but an education, impeccable penmanship, and the desperate hope that a mail-order marriage might offer stability in an uncertain world. The correspondence with Jonathan Whitmore had been brief but encouraging. A widowed farmer seeking a woman of good character to help manage his household and provide companionship. His letters had painted a picture of a modest but prosperous homestead, a man honest about his need for partnership rather than romantic love, and the promise of a quiet life built on mutual respect and shared responsibility. Millbrook, the driver called, his voice barely audible above the wind. End of the line, miss. Sarah gathered her courage along with her belongings, stepping down from the coach onto the dusty main street. The settlement consisted of perhaps 24 buildings, a general store, a small church with a crooked steeple, a saloon from which piano music drifted into the afternoon air, and scattered houses that looked as if they were fighting a losing battle against the relentless prairie. Wind. A few curious faces appeared in windows and doorways, drawn by the unusual sight of a well-dressed woman arriving alone. Sarah felt their gazes like physical weight, the speculation and judgment of small-town residents encountering a stranger. She had expected this scrutiny, but it still made her stomach flutter with nervous energy. "Excuse me," she called to a middle-aged woman sweeping her front porch. "I'm looking for Jonathan Whitmore. I believe he has a farm near here." The woman's broom stilled, and her expression shifted from mild curiosity to something that looked almost like pity. "You must be the mail-order bride," she said quietly, setting aside her broom and approaching with careful steps. "I'm Martha Henderson. My husband runs the general store." Sarah nodded, extending her hand politely. "Sarah Montgomery." "Yes, I've come to marry Mr. Whitmore. Could you direct me to his property?" Martha's weathered face creased with concern. "Miss Montgomery, I think there's something you need to know before you go out there. Jonathan Whitmore died 6 weeks ago. Fever took him sudden-like. We sent word to the address he gave us, but maybe it didn't reach you in time." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. 6 weeks ago, she would have been traveling, moving between temporary lodgings as she liquidated the last of her family's possessions and prepared for her journey west. The letter would have arrived at an empty house, filed away by lawyers who had no way to contact her. "I see," Sarah managed, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. The ground beneath her feet suddenly felt less solid, as if the prairie wind might pick her up and scatter her like the tumbleweeds rolling past. "I suppose I'll need to arrange return passage to Chicago then." "Miss Montgomery," Martha said gently, "the next eastbound stage doesn't come through for 2 weeks. And even then, the fare." She left the sentence unfinished, but Sarah understood. The little money she had brought was meant to last until she could establish herself as Jonathan Whitmore's wife. It wouldn't stretch to cover unexpected travel expenses and 2 weeks of room and board. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, fighting the familiar sensation of walls closing in around her. This was how it had felt in Chicago as creditors circled her family's estate, as friends became distant and opportunities evaporated. She had thought marriage to a stranger on the frontier would at least provide certainty, but apparently, even the most desperate plans could crumble. "Is there work available in town?" she asked, opening her eyes and forcing steel into her voice. She had survived worse than this. She could survive again. Martha's expression grew thoughtful. "Well, the schoolteacher moved to California last month. The town council's been looking for someone qualified to teach the children. The pay isn't much, but there's a small cabin that comes with the position. Teaching." Sarah felt a flutter of hope. She had tutored children from wealthy families in Chicago, had even briefly considered pursuing formal teacher training before her father's business collapse changed everything. It wasn't the secure marriage she had planned, but it was something. "I have experience with children's education," Sarah said quickly. "I taught several families' children in Chicago, including advanced mathematics and literature. I can provide references, though they might take time to reach here." "The council meets tonight," Martha said. "If you're serious about staying, I could speak to my husband about introducing you to the other members. But Miss Montgomery, there's something else you should know about the Whitmore place." Sarah waited, sensing that whatever Martha was about to tell her would be significant. Jonathan had been caring for some children out there. Orphans, we think, though nobody knows the whole story. After he died, some of the men went out to settle his affairs, but the children had disappeared, vanished completely. The house was empty, like they'd never been there at all. "How many children?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure why the details mattered. 6 of them, from what Jonathan told people. Never brought them to town, never sent them to school. Kept to himself mostly, Jonathan did, especially after his own family died. Some folks thought he might be imagining things, grief playing tricks on his mind. Sarah absorbed this information with growing curiosity rather than concern. 6 orphaned children, suddenly homeless after their caretaker's death. Where would they have gone? How were they surviving? "No one has looked for them since?" she asked. Martha shrugged. "This is hard country, Miss Montgomery. People die or disappear all the time. The men figured the children probably moved on, maybe found relatives somewhere. It's not uncommon for folks to just vanish out here." But Sarah's mind was working differently. 6 children didn't simply vanish into the prairie air. Children needed shelter, food, protection. If they hadn't appeared in any of the surrounding towns, and if no relatives had claimed them, then they were still out there somewhere. And if they were still in the area, they would need help. "Could someone show me the way to the Whitmore place?" Sarah asked impulsively. "I'd like to see it before I make any decisions about staying." Martha's eyebrows rose. "It's nearly 3 miles out of town, and the sun's getting low. You'd be better off waiting until morning." "I have time before dark," Sarah insisted. "And I'd prefer to know what I'm facing before I commit to anything." Something in her tone must have convinced Martha, because the older woman nodded slowly. "My son Tommy can ride out with you, show you the way. But Miss Montgomery, that place has been empty for weeks. Don't expect to find anything but an abandoned homestead." An hour later, Sarah sat beside 17-year-old Tommy Henderson on the bench of a borrowed wagon, her carpetbag at her feet, as they rolled across the endless grassland toward Jonathan Whitmore's farm. The boy was friendly enough, chattering about the town's residents and pointing out landmarks, but Sarah found herself only half listening. Her attention was caught by the landscape itself, the way the afternoon light painted the prairie grass. In shades of gold and amber, the vast sky that seemed to stretch beyond the edges of the world. It was beautiful in a way that Chicago's crowded streets had never been, but it was also profoundly lonely. She could understand how someone might disappear out here, swallowed by the sheer immensity of space and silence. "There it is," Tommy said, pointing ahead to where a modest wooden house sat in a shallow valley, surrounded by a few outbuildings and the remains of what had once been a vegetable garden. Smoke was not rising from the chimney, and the windows stared emptily across the prairie like dead eyes. As they approached, Sarah could see evidence of recent abandonment. The front door hung slightly ajar, moving gently in the wind. Dried corn stalks lay scattered across the yard, and a broken water bucket sat overturned near what had been a well. "Looks like nobody's been here since Jonathan died," Tommy observed, bringing the wagon to a halt near the front porch. "You want to look inside?" Sarah nodded, though something about the silent house made her skin prickle with unease. It wasn't fear exactly, but a sense that important things had happened here, that the emptiness was more significant than simple. Abandonment. The house's interior told the story of a life interrupted. Dishes still sat on the kitchen table, though they were now covered with dust. A child's small shoe lay forgotten under a chair. Books were scattered on a shelf as if someone had been looking for something specific. But there were no signs of recent habitation, no indication that 6 children had sheltered here after Jonathan's death. "Strange," Sarah murmured, picking up the small shoe and turning it over in her hands. It was well worn but carefully maintained, the leather polished smooth by use. "This doesn't look like it belonged to an imaginary child." Tommy shifted uncomfortably. In the doorway, Ma always said Jonathan was telling the truth about the kids. Said he was too practical a man for flights of fancy. But where could 6 children go in country like this? Sarah moved through the house methodically, her trained eye taking in details that might escape casual observation. In what had been Jonathan's bedroom, she found additional evidence of children: a stack of worn primers, a small wooden horse carved with obvious care, and a woman's hairbrush that suggested these children had included at least one girl. But it was in the kitchen that she made her most significant discovery. On the wall near the back door, someone had drawn 6 small marks in charcoal, each about the height a child might reach. Below them, in a careful hand that suggested some education, were written the words, "Cave behind the big rock when danger." "Comey's, Tommy," Sarah called quietly. "Come look at this." The boy joined her in the kitchen, squinting at the faded writing. "Cave behind the big rock? What do you think that means?" Sarah's pulse quickened as she stared at the message. It looked like an instruction, the kind of emergency plan a careful guardian might establish with children in his care. If something happened to Jonathan, if danger threatened, they were to go to a cave behind a big rock. "Is there a cave formation near here?" she asked urgently. Tommy thought for a moment. "There's some limestone outcroppings about a mile north, along Willow Creek. Lots of caves in those rocks, some pretty deep. But Miss Montgomery, if those children went there 6 weeks ago..." He didn't finish the sentence, but Sarah understood. 6 weeks was a long time for children to survive in wilderness conditions, especially as weather turned colder. But it was also possible that they had found shelter, that they were still alive and waiting for someone to find them. "I want to look," Sarah said decisively. "Before we go back to town, I want to check those caves." Tommy's young face creased with worry. "It'll be full dark soon. And if there's nothing there but old bones... then at least we'll know," Sarah replied. "And if there's something else, if they're still alive, then every hour we delay could matter." The limestone formations along Willow Creek rose from the prairie like ancient sentinels, their weathered surfaces carved into fantastic shapes by centuries of wind and water. As Tommy guided the wagon along the creek bank, Sarah spotted several dark openings in the rock face, caves that could provide shelter for desperate children. "There," she said, pointing to the largest formation. That big rock there, with the cave entrance beneath it. That has to be what the message meant. They left the wagon by the creek and approached the cave on foot, Tommy carrying a lantern he had brought from the house. The entrance was narrow but wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and as they drew closer, Sarah caught a scent that made her heart leap. Wood smoke, faint but unmistakable. "Someone's been burning fires in there," she whispered to Tommy, whose eyes had gone wide with realization before the boy could respond. Sarah called softly toward the cave entrance, her voice gentle but carrying clearly in the still air. "Hello, is anyone there? My name is Sarah Montgomery. I'm here to help." Silence answered her, but it was not the empty silence of abandonment. It was the tense quiet of hidden creatures deciding whether to trust or flee. "I came to marry Jonathan." "Whitmore," Sarah continued, settling herself on a rock near the cave entrance to appear less threatening. "I know he's gone. I know you've been alone, but you don't have to hide anymore." Minutes passed without response, but Sarah remained patient, sensing movement in the darkness beyond the cave entrance. Finally, just as the last light was fading from the western sky, a small figure emerged from the shadows. It was a girl, perhaps 10 years old, with tangled brown hair and enormous dark eyes that held far too much wariness for her age. She wore a patched dress that had seen better days and moved with the careful silence of someone who had learned that survival depended on not being noticed. "Are you really here to help?" the girl asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Sarah said simply, her heart breaking at the question. "I'm here to help." The girl studied Sarah's face for a long moment, then turned toward the cave entrance and made a soft clicking sound with her tongue. One by one, 5 more children emerged from the darkness, 2 boys who appeared to be twins, perhaps 8 years old. Another girl with red hair who might have been 12. A boy of maybe 6 who clutched a carved wooden horse. And finally, a tiny girl who couldn't have been more than 4, her thumb firmly planted in her mouth. 6 children, just as the townspeople had said. 6 pairs of eyes that watched Sarah with the desperate hope of creatures who had been hiding for so long. They had almost forgotten what safety felt like. "I'm Emma," the first girl said quietly. "These are my brothers and sisters. We've been waiting for someone to come." Sarah looked at these 6 silent children, these survivors who had somehow managed to endure 6 weeks in a cave, and felt something shift inside her chest. This wasn't the life she had planned, wasn't the secure marriage and comfortable domesticity she had sought. But sometimes the most important things found you when you weren't looking for them. "Well," she said, standing up and brushing dust from her skirts, "I think it's time we got you all home." The children exchanged glances, and Emma stepped forward slightly. "We don't have a home anymore. Jonathan's gone, and the house ... She gestured helplessly toward the distant farmstead. "Then we'll have to build one," Sarah said with more confidence than she felt. "All of us together. That's what families do." As Tommy helped her gather the children and their meager possessions for the journey back to town, Sarah found herself thinking about the mysterious message on Jonathan Whitmore's kitchen wall, about 6 children who had survived impossible circumstances through courage and careful planning, and about the unexpected way life could reshape itself around the things that mattered most. She had come to Nebraska seeking security and found instead 6 reasons to be brave. The mail-order marriage she had planned was impossible, but perhaps what she had discovered was better, a chance to build something entirely new from the foundation of love and determination. The stars were emerging overhead as their wagon rolled back toward Millbrook. 6 silent children huddled together in the wagon bed, and a woman who was just beginning to understand that sometimes the greatest adventures began with the courage to say yes to the impossible. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning after discovering the children brought Sarah her first real glimpse into the magnitude of what she had undertaken. Martha Henderson had graciously offered her spare room for the night, and the 6 children had been given makeshift beds in the store's back room. But as dawn broke over Millbrook, Sarah realized that temporary charity would not solve the deeper challenges these children represented. Emma, the eldest at 10, had appointed herself the unofficial spokesperson for the group, but even she revealed information reluctantly, as if words themselves carried danger. The other 5 children, the twin boys she learned were named Michael and Matthew, 12-year-old Lucy with her shock of red hair, 6-year-old David who never released his grip on the wooden horse, and tiny 4-year-old Rebecca communicated primarily through glances, gestures, and a complex system of soft sounds that seemed to carry meaning only among themselves. "How long were you with Jonathan?" Sarah asked Emma as she helped distribute bowls of porridge in the store's cramped back room. The children ate with the mechanical efficiency of those who had learned not to waste food, but their eyes never stopped moving, constantly checking exits and monitoring the adults around them. Emma's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. 2 years, she said quietly, maybe longer. Time gets mixed up when you're moving so much. Moving? Sarah sat down carefully on a wooden crate, positioning herself at the children's eye level rather than looming over them. She had learned this technique while tutoring shy students in Chicago. Make yourself smaller, less threatening. Let them set the pace of trust. Before Jonathan, Emma explained, her voice barely above a whisper, we moved at night mostly. Different places, different people, some good, some. She didn't finish the sentence, but the way little Rebecca instinctively moved closer to her sister spoke volumes. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October morning. These children had been running from something or someone. Jonathan Whitmore hadn't simply taken in orphans. He had provided sanctuary for children who needed to disappear. Emma, Sarah said gently, I need to understand what happened before I can help you properly. Are there people looking for you? People you're afraid of? The question triggered an immediate response. All 6 children went completely still, there, breathing shallow, their eyes fixed on Sarah with the intensity of deer sensing a predator. It was Michael or perhaps Matthew. She couldn't yet tell them apart who finally spoke. The man with the silver watch, he said in a voice hoarse from disuse. He had papers. Said we belonged to him. Lucy nodded frantically, her red curls bouncing, had our names written down. All of us said we were his property until we worked off the debt. Sarah's blood ran cold as the implications became clear. These weren't ordinary orphans. They were children who had been sold or indentured, trapped in some form of legal bondage that had driven them to flee across multiple states. Jonathan Whitmore had been harboring runaway children from what was essentially a form of slavery. This man, Sarah said carefully, does he know you were with Jonathan? Emma's face went pale. We don't know. Jonathan always said if anyone came asking questions, we should go to the cave and wait. Wait until it was safe or until someone we could trust found us. How did you know to trust me? Sarah asked. David, the 6-year-old, looked up from his wooden horse for the first time. You have teacher hands, he said simply. Soft hands that don't hit. Jonathan taught us to watch hands. The observation broke Sarah's heart even as it revealed Jonathan Whitmore's wisdom. These children had been trained to read danger in the smallest details, to survival scan every adult they encountered for signs of threat or safety. Commotion outside interrupted their conversation. Through the store's front window, Sarah could see a small crowd gathering around a well-dressed stranger who had arrived on horseback. The man was questioning townspeople with the persistence of someone conducting official business, and Sarah noticed how Martha Henderson kept glancing nervously toward the store's back room. Stay here, Sarah whispered to the children, but Emma was already moving, herding the others toward the store's rear exit with practiced efficiency. Back door. Emma breathed. Always know where the back door is. Sarah's mind raced as she watched the children prepare to flee. They couldn't spend their lives running, hiding in caves and sleeping in storage rooms. But they also couldn't be captured by whatever system had originally trapped them. Somehow she needed to find a way to protect them legally, to give them legitimate status that would shield them from anyone who might claim ownership. The stranger outside was closer now, and Sarah could hear fragments of his conversation with the townspeople. 6 children, ward of the state, legal authority, ... The words chilled her, but they also sparked an idea. "Emma, wait," she called softly. The girl turned back, her face tense with the familiar readiness to run. "What if I told you there might be a way to make you safe? Legally safe, so you never have to hide again?" "There's no such thing as safe," Emma replied with the bitter wisdom of a child who had learned too much too young. "There's only hidden. Not if you belong to someone who can protect you," Sarah said, the plan forming even as she spoke. "Not if you have a guardian with legal rights stronger than whoever is looking for you." The stranger was approaching the store now, his boots heavy on the wooden boardwalk. Sarah made a split-second decision that would change all their lives. "Martha!" she called toward the front of the store. "I need to speak with the town council immediately. I want to apply for legal guardianship of 6 children, and I need it done today." The legal proceedings that followed were unlike anything Millbrook had seen before. Judge Harrison, who normally handled property disputes and minor criminal matters, found himself presiding over an emergency guardianship hearing in the town hall while a mysterious stranger with official-looking papers waited outside. Claiming authority over the same children. Sarah had spent the morning frantically preparing her case with the help of Martha Henderson and the town's only lawyer, a young man named Thomas Bradley who had recently arrived from Denver with modern ideas about children's rights and legal protections. "Mrs. Montgomery," Judge Harrison said, consulting the hastily prepared documents, "you're asking this court to grant you immediate guardianship over 6 children you met yesterday. You have no established income, no permanent residence, and no prior legal relationship with these minors. On what grounds should we approve this request?" Sarah stood before the makeshift court, acutely aware that 6 young lives hung in the balance of her words. The children sat in the back row, Emma holding Rebecca on her lap while the others clustered close enough to touch each other, drawing strength from their shared presence. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, "these children have been without protection for 6 weeks. They've survived through their own resourcefulness and courage, but they need legal status to prevent them from being claimed by those who would exploit them." The stranger, who had identified himself as Marcus Fleming, a representative of the Riverside Industrial School in Illinois, stood to object. "Your Honor, these children are legal wards of our institution. They were indentured to us for educational purposes and training in useful trades. Their flight from legal custody makes them fugitives, not candidates for alternative guardianship." Judge Harrison frowned. "Mr. Fleming, do you have documentation proving legal custody?" Fleming produced a leather portfolio filled with official-looking papers. Indenture contracts signed by the children's previous guardians, authorizing the Riverside School to provide education and training in exchange for labor until the age of 18. These contracts are legally binding. Sarah felt the case slipping away until Thomas Bradley stepped forward. "Your Honor, if I may examine those contracts?" For several tense minutes, Bradley studied the documents while the children waited in terrified silence. Sarah could see Emma calculating distances to exits, preparing for another flight that might take them even further from any chance of stability. "Your Honor," Bradley finally announced, "these contracts were signed by individuals claiming to be the children's guardians, but there's no documentation proving those individuals had legal authority to indenture these minors. Furthermore, the contracts specify educational services, but I see no evidence of actual schooling being provided." Fleming's confident demeanor cracked slightly. The children receive practical education in valuable trades. Learning discipline and work ethic is education. At what ages did these children begin their education? Bradley pressed. The contracts specify various ages, Fleming replied evasively. Mr. Fleming, Judge Harrison interjected, please state the specific ages at which each child entered your institution. The silence that followed spoke volumes. Finally, Fleming admitted, some were as young as 4 or 5. Early placement ensures better adaptation to institutional requirements. A murmur of outrage rippled through the packed town hall. Sarah saw her opening and took it. Your Honor, she said firmly, 4-year-old children cannot legally consent to indenture contracts. They cannot be bound to labor agreements that extend until adulthood. Mr. Fleming is describing child slavery, not education. Judge Harrison's expression had grown increasingly stern as the true nature of the Riverside Industrial School became apparent. Mr. Fleming, I'm concerned about the legality of these arrangements. Children of 4 and 5 years old cannot be held to labor. Contracts. The contracts were signed by their legal guardians, Fleming insisted, but his voice lacked its earlier authority. Guardians whose legal status you cannot document, Bradley pointed out. Your Honor, I move that these contracts be declared invalid due to lack of proper legal foundation and violation of territorial statutes regarding child welfare. The hearing continued for another hour as Bradley systematically dismantled Fleming's claims while Sarah provided testimony about the children's condition, their evident trauma, and their need for genuine care rather than institutional exploitation. Finally, Judge Harrison rendered his decision. This court finds that the children in question are not legally bound to the Riverside Industrial School. The contracts presented are invalid due to improper authorization and violation of territorial child protection statutes. Furthermore, this court grants temporary guardianship to Sarah Elizabeth Montgomery, pending formal adoption proceedings. The relief that flooded through Sarah was so intense she nearly collapsed. Behind her, she heard Emma's sharp intake of breath, the first purely emotional sound the girl had made since they met. But Fleming wasn't finished. Your Honor, this decision exceeds territorial authority. The Riverside School operates under federal oversight. We will appeal this ruling and seek federal intervention. Judge Harrison's eyes flashed. Mr. Fleming, you may certainly appeal. However, until such time as a higher court overrules this decision, these children remain under Mrs. Montgomery's protection. Furthermore, I strongly suggest that your institution review its practices regarding the treatment of minors, as this court is prepared to recommend a federal investigation into your operations. As the courtroom emptied, Sarah found herself surrounded by 6 children who were no longer hiding, no longer scanning for exits, no longer preparing to run. For the first time since she had met them, they looked like what they were, children who had been carrying burdens too heavy for their small shoulders and were finally being offered the chance to set them down. Are we really safe now? Emma asked, her voice trembling with hope she was afraid to fully embrace. Sarah knelt down to meet Emma's eyes directly. You're really safe. You belong with me now, and no one can take you away. Little Rebecca, who hadn't spoken a word since Sarah had found them, suddenly reached out and touched Sarah's face with one small finger. Mama? She whispered. The word hit Sarah like a physical blow, carrying with it the weight of responsibility, love, and the terrifying knowledge that 6 young lives now depended entirely on her ability to build something stable from nothing. Yes, sweetheart, Sarah whispered back, gathering Rebecca into her arms as the other children pressed close. I'm going to be your mama now. As they walked out of the town hall together, Sarah carrying Rebecca while the others clustered around her. Like chicks seeking the protection of a hen's wings, she caught sight of Marcus Fleming mounting his horse. His face was dark with fury, and she knew this victory was only the beginning of a longer battle. But for now, 6 children who had spent months running and hiding were walking freely down the small town's main street, protected by legal documents that proclaimed them worthy of love and care rather than labor and exploitation. The real work of rebuilding their lives was just beginning. But as Sarah felt small hands slip into hers and heard David humming softly to his wooden horse, she knew she had made the right choice. Sometimes the most important decisions weren't about what you planned to do with your life, but about what you were willing to do when life placed something precious and fragile in your hands. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, finding permanent housing, establishing routines, helping traumatized children learn to trust in safety. But tonight, 6 children would sleep in real beds without fear. And a woman who had come west seeking security would discover that the greatest security came from being needed by those who had nowhere else to turn. The teaching position Sarah had hoped for became reality within a week of the guardianship hearing, but not in the way she had expected. The Millbrook Town Council, witnessing her fierce protection of the 6 children and recognizing her educational background, offered her not just the vacant schoolteacher role, but something unprecedented: the authority to establish a specialized school for children who had experienced trauma. "We've got more children like yours than anyone wants to admit," Councilman Robert Patterson explained as he showed Sarah the abandoned building that would become her classroom. "Children who've run from bad situations, families torn apart by poverty or violence. Regular schooling doesn't work for them. They need something different." The building had once housed a failed merchant store, its large windows facing east to catch the morning light. The space was raw and empty, with bare wooden floors and walls that bore the stains of previous occupants. But Sarah could envision what it might become: desks arranged in small clusters rather than rigid rows, areas for different types of learning, spaces where frightened children could feel safe enough to remember how to be curious. Her own 6 children stood in the center of the empty room, their eyes moving constantly as they mapped this new environment. Even after a week of living in the small cabin behind the schoolhouse, they maintained their survival habits, checking exits, positioning themselves where they could see all approaches, speaking in whispers that wouldn't carry to unfriendly ears. "What do you think?" Sarah asked Emma, who had become her unofficial advisor on matters relating to traumatized children. "Can you imagine learning here?" Emma studied the space with the serious consideration of someone much older than her 10 years. "Windows are good," she said finally. "You can see who's coming. And that door in the back, is it locked from the inside?" "It can be," Sarah assured her. "Would that make you feel safer?" "Not just me," Emma replied, glancing at her siblings. "All of us, we don't like being trapped." The comment revealed the depth of their conditioning. These children had been trained by harsh experience to always maintain escape routes, to never allow themselves to be cornered. Building trust would require proving that safety could exist without the constant possibility of flight. Sarah's first challenge came not from the children's resistance to learning, but from their desperate hunger for it. Once they understood that education was truly being offered rather than used as a cover for exploitation, their eagerness was heartbreaking. Lucy, the 12-year-old with red hair, could read at a level far beyond her years, but had never been allowed access to books beyond basic primers. When Sarah showed her the small library she was assembling, Lucy's hands trembled as she touched the volumes of poetry and adventure stories. "These are for us to read," Lucy whispered. "Not just to look at. They're for you to enjoy," Sarah confirmed. Reading should be one of life's great pleasures, not just a skill for following orders. The twins, Michael and Matthew, had been separated for so long during their institutional placement that they had developed an almost telepathic communication system. They could solve mathematical problems by dividing the work between them in ways that mystified Sarah until she realized they were essentially functioning as 2 halves of a single mind. 6-year-old David remained largely nonverbal, But he possessed an extraordinary ability to understand mechanical systems. Give him a broken clock or a wagon with a loose wheel, and his small hands would work with the precision of a trained craftsman. His wooden horse, Sarah learned, was actually a complex puzzle toy that he had taken apart and reassembled hundreds of times as a way of managing anxiety. 4-year-old Rebecca was the most challenging case. Her vocabulary was limited not by intelligence, but by trauma that had taught her that speaking drew dangerous attention. She communicated primarily through gestures and drawings, creating elaborate pictures that told stories she couldn't yet voice. "She remembers everything," Emma explained one evening as they watched Rebecca carefully arranging her few possessions. "But remembering hurts, so she keeps the words locked up inside." Sarah was developing teaching methods as she went, learning from each child's responses and adapting her approach to meet needs she had never encountered in her Chicago tutoring experience. Traditional classroom management techniques were useless with children who had been conditioned to view authority with suspicion and structure as potential imprisonment. Instead, she created what she called invitation learning, offering opportunities for education that children could accept or decline without pressure. A mathematics lesson might begin with David building something while Michael and Matthew calculated measurements, drawing Lucy's attention if the project interested her, gradually expanding to include whoever wanted to participate. The breakthrough came 3 weeks into their new routine, when Sarah discovered something that would change everything. The children possessed knowledge that could help other trauma survivors. It happened by accident. A new student had been brought to the school, a 7-year-old boy named Timothy, whose family had been killed in a wagon train attack. He sat in the corner, rocking back and forth, his eyes vacant with shock. The traditional approaches Sarah had tried, gentle encouragement, offering food, speaking softly, had no effect. But Emma noticed something Sarah had missed. Without asking permission, the girl approached Timothy and began making this soft clicking sounds Sarah had heard the children use among themselves. Timothy's rocking stopped. Emma clicked again, then waited. After several minutes, Timothy clicked back. "He's talking," Lucy whispered in amazement. "Emma's talking to him in survivor language." "Survivor language?" Sarah asked. "It's what we call it," Michael explained quietly. "When you can't use words because words aren't safe, you find other ways. Emma's the best at it." Sarah watched in fascination as Emma continued her soundless conversation with Timothy. Gradually, the boy's rigid posture relaxed. His breathing deepened. When Emma offered him her hand, he took it. "How did you know?" Sarah asked Emma later. Emma shrugged with characteristic modesty. "When you've been where he's been, you recognize the signs. He's not ready for words yet, but he needs to know he's not alone." This incident sparked an idea that would transform Sarah's small school into something much larger. If her children could help other traumatized children, if their survival skills could be channeled into healing rather than just hiding, then perhaps they could build something that served the broader community while giving her children a sense of purpose. "What if," Sarah proposed to the town council a week later, "we expanded the school to include peer counseling? What if children who have survived trauma could help other children who are struggling with similar experiences?" The proposal was radical for 1880s Nebraska. The idea that children could be teachers, that survivors could become healers, challenged conventional notions about education and authority. But the results spoke for themselves. Timothy had made more progress in a week with Emma's help than in months of adult intervention. Word of the unique school began to spread beyond Millbrook. Families from neighboring towns started arriving with children who had been written off as unreachable. A girl who hadn't spoken since witnessing her parents' deaths. Twin boys who had been living wild in the woods after escaping an abusive foster situation. A teenage girl who had fled an arranged marriage to an older man. Each new arrival brought fresh challenges, but also new possibilities. Sarah's original 6 children rose to meet each challenge, their own healing accelerated by the opportunity to help others. Emma became the unofficial leader of peer counseling, her ability to communicate with traumatized children developing into something approaching genius. The twins, Michael and Matthew, created systems for teaching basic academics to children whose concentration had been shattered by trauma. They developed games that made learning feel like play, puzzles that built confidence while teaching essential skills. Lucy discovered her gift for storytelling, creating narratives that helped younger children process their experiences safely. Her tales featured brave characters who faced impossible odds and found ways to triumph through cleverness and cooperation rather than force. David's mechanical aptitude became a form of therapy, both for himself and others. Building and fixing things provided concrete proof that broken items could be made whole again, a metaphor that resonated deeply with children who felt irreparably damaged. Even Rebecca began to emerge from her protective silence, finding her voice through singing rather than speaking. Her wordless songs seemed to reach children who had retreated so deeply into themselves that no other communication could touch them. But success brought new dangers. The innovative school attracted attention from educational reformers and child welfare advocates, which was encouraging. It also attracted attention from those who profited from existing systems of child exploitation. Marcus Fleming's promised appeal had materialized as a federal investigation into Sarah's guardianship and the school's unconventional methods. Government inspectors arrived unannounced, armed with official credentials and lists of regulations that the specialized school couldn't possibly meet. "This facility lacks proper certification," declared Inspector Harold Morrison, a thin man with steel-rimmed glasses who seemed to disapprove of everything he observed. "The teaching methods are unorthodox and potentially harmful. These children should be placed in properly regulated institutions where they can receive standardized care." Sarah felt the familiar chill of bureaucratic threat, but this time she wasn't facing it alone. Her children, all of them now, stood behind her with the quiet determination of those who had found something worth fighting for. "Inspector Morrison," Sarah replied carefully, "I invite you to observe our students' progress before making final judgments. Traditional institutions failed these children. Our methods succeed." The inspection that followed was unlike anything Morrison had expected. Instead of finding chaos and neglect, he discovered children who were thriving in ways that defied conventional understanding. Students who had been considered unteachable were solving complex problems, creating art, helping newcomers adapt to safety. "This is highly irregular," Morrison muttered as he watched Emma successfully calm a newly arrived child who had been catatonic for months. "Children shouldn't be providing therapeutic services to other children." "Why not?" asked Lucy, who had been eavesdropping with characteristic boldness. "We know what it feels like. Adults who've never been hurt don't understand the same way." Morrison's discomfort was evident, but so was his growing recognition that something remarkable was happening in this unconventional school. Children who should have been broken were not only healing but helping others heal. The very irregularity he criticized was producing results that traditional methods had failed to achieve. The crisis came when Morrison announced his preliminary decision. The school would be closed, and all students would be transferred to state-approved institutions. The experimental program Sarah had built would be dismantled in the name of regulatory compliance. The children's reaction was swift and unified. For the first time since Sarah had known them, they stopped hiding. Instead of preparing to flee, they stood together in the main classroom, their small voices joining in a refusal that shook the foundations of bureaucratic authority. "We won't go," Emma announced simply. "This is our home. These are our family. We won't be separated again." The standoff that followed would test everything Sarah had learned about courage, community, and the power of love to triumph over institutional indifference. But as she looked at the faces of children who had chosen to fight rather than flee, She knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. The girl who had come to Nebraska seeking safety in marriage had instead found her purpose in motherhood. To children who needed someone willing to stand between them, and a world that saw them as problems to be managed rather than people to be cherished. The battle for their future was just beginning, but for the first time, Sarah was confident they could win. The telegram arrived on a gray November morning that would forever divide Sarah's life into before and after. Martha Henderson delivered it personally, her weathered face grim with the knowledge that some messages carried the weight of destiny. "Federal Marshal's Office," Martha said simply, placing the yellow paper in Sarah's trembling hands. "Came through this morning." Sarah. Read the terse message twice before its implications fully registered. Federal custody order issued. All minors currently under Montgomery guardianship to be transferred to designated facilities within 72 hours. Compliance mandatory. Non-compliance will result in criminal charges. The children gathered around her desk as if sensing crisis, their faces reflecting the familiar tension of those who had learned to read danger in adult expressions. But something was different this time. Instead of preparing to scatter, they moved closer together, forming a protective circle around Sarah's chair. "They're coming for us again, aren't they?" Emma asked with the flat acceptance of someone much older than her 11 years. Sarah looked into the faces of the children who had become her world, seeing not just fear but determination. They had found something worth defending, and unlike their previous experiences, they weren't facing this threat alone. "Yes," Sarah said quietly, "but this time is different. This time we fight back." The next 72 hours transformed Millbrook into something resembling a fortress under siege. Word of the federal order spread quickly through the tight-knit community, triggering an unexpected response that surprised even Sarah with its intensity. Judge Harrison was the first to arrive at the schoolhouse, his usually measured demeanor replaced by righteous anger. "This is territorial overreach," he declared, spreading legal documents across Sarah's desk. "Federal authorities cannot simply override local guardianship orders without due process." Thomas Bradley, the young lawyer who had defended them in the original hearing, arrived with reinforcements, 3 colleagues from Denver who specialized in constitutional law. They set up a makeshift legal office in the school's main room, their urgent conversations punctuated by the scratching of pens on legal briefs. "The federal government claims jurisdiction under the Interstate Commerce Clause," Bradley explained to Sarah as children quietly moved around them, continuing their studies. "Despite the chaos, they're arguing that your school disrupts legitimate business operations by harboring runaway laborers." "Runaway slaves, you mean?" Sarah corrected angrily. "Children who were sold into bondage." "Exactly," Bradley agreed. "But proving that requires more evidence than we currently possess. We need documentation of the abuse, testimony from other survivors, proof that these industrial schools are operating outside the law." It was Lucy who provided the breakthrough. The red-haired 12-year-old approached the lawyers with characteristic directness, carrying a cloth bundle that she had kept hidden since arriving at the school. "I saved these," she announced, unwrapping the bundle to reveal a collection of papers, photographs, and personal items from the school where they kept us. "Emma said I should throw them away, but I thought someday we might need proof." The documents Lucy had preserved painted a devastating picture of systematic exploitation. Work schedules showing children laboring 14 hours daily, medical records documenting untreated injuries and malnutrition, correspondence between institutional officials discussing the productivity of their youngest workers. Most damning of all was a photograph showing dozens of children in identical gray uniforms, their faces bearing the hollow expressions of those whose spirits had been systematically crushed. In the corner of the image, barely visible, were 4 familiar faces: Lucy herself, the twins Michael and Matthew, and little David clutching his wooden horse. "This is it," Bradley breathed, studying the documents with growing excitement. This is evidence of criminal violations of federal labor laws. No court can ignore this. But even as the legal team worked frantically to prepare their case, another battle was taking shape in the streets of Millbrook. The approaching federal intervention had awakened something in the town's residents that surprised everyone, including themselves. Robert Patterson, the council member who had first supported Sarah's school, stood before a packed town hall meeting. With the passion of a preacher delivering salvation. "For 20 years, we've watched children disappear from our communities," he declared to the assembled crowd. Taken by officials claiming legal authority, sent to institutions that promised education and delivered exploitation. How many times have we stood silent while the vulnerable were sacrificed to systems that profit from their suffering? The response was immediate and overwhelming. Farmers who had lost children to similar schemes, mothers who had watched neighbors, families torn apart by bureaucratic orders, men who remembered their own harsh treatment in institutions, all spoke with voices that grew stronger as they realized they were not alone. "We stand with Sarah Montgomery," declared Anna Hoffman, whose own son had been taken by federal authorities 3 years earlier and never heard from again. "We stand with these children who have found safety and purpose in our community." The town's support manifested in practical ways that moved Sarah to tears. Families brought food to sustain the lawyers working around the clock. Men volunteered to stand guard around the school, their hunting rifles prominently displayed as a silent message to any federal agents who might arrive early. Women organized a communication network that could spread word of approaching officials across the county within hours. Most importantly, other survivors began to emerge from their hiding places. The first was Jonas Carmichael, a 16-year-old, who had escaped from a mining operation in Colorado where children were used for dangerous underground work. He arrived at the school on foot, having walked nearly 200 miles after hearing rumors of a place where runaways could find sanctuary. "Is it true?" he asked Sarah, his eyes holding the same wariness she had seen in her own children. "Is there really a place where they can't take you back?" Within days, Jonas was followed by others, siblings who had fled textile mills in Illinois, children who had escaped agricultural labor camps in Kansas, teenagers who had run from domestic servitude arrangements that amounted to slavery. Each arrival brought new testimony and fresh evidence of the widespread nature of child exploitation, but these new arrivals also brought danger. The growing population of runaway children made Millbrook impossible to ignore, and federal authorities responded with increasing pressure. Marshal William Crawford arrived on the second day with a small army of deputies, establishing a command post at the town's only hotel. His message to Sarah was delivered through official channels, but carried personal menace: surrender the children voluntarily or face arrest for harboring fugitives and obstructing federal law enforcement. Sarah's response surprised everyone, including herself. Standing before Crawford and his deputies in the schoolhouse main room, surrounded by children who had chosen to stand with her rather than run, she delivered words that would be remembered long after the immediate crisis had passed. "Marshal Crawford," she said with calm authority, "these children are not fugitives. They are survivors. They are not property to be returned to their owners. They are human beings deserving of protection under the law. If you want to arrest me for providing safety to children who had nowhere else to turn, then I will wear those charges as a badge of honor." The confrontation that followed revealed the true stakes of their battle. Crawford produced federal warrants for the arrest of specific children, documents that named them as escaped laborers, and authorized their forcible return to the institutions from which they had fled. Emma Hartwell, Crawford read from his list, escaped from Riverside Industrial School in April. Michael and Matthew Stevens escaped from Morrison Agricultural Training Facility in June. Lucy Pemberton, David Crenshaw, Rebecca Walshaw listed as fugitive laborers subject to immediate return. Each name on the list represented years of carefully constructed new identities. Safety that could be destroyed with the stroke of a pen. But as Crawford read, something remarkable happened. Other children stepped forward, one by one, placing themselves between the marshal and his intended targets. "I'm Emma Hartwell," announced Timothy, the boy Emma had helped heal when he first arrived. "No, I'm Emma Hartwell," declared Jonas Carmichael. "We're all Emma Hartwell," said a dozen voices in unison. The children had created their own form of resistance, making it impossible for authorities to identify specific individuals without arresting everyone. They had transformed from isolated victims into a unified community that protected its most vulnerable members. Marshal Crawford's frustration was evident as he faced this unexpected solidarity. His orders were specific, but his identification was impossible when every child claimed to be someone else. "This is obstruction of justice," he warned Sarah. "You're teaching these children to defy legal authority." "I'm teaching them that they have value beyond their labor," Sarah replied. "I'm teaching them that adults can be trusted to protect rather than exploit them. I'm teaching them that they belong to themselves, not to institutions that profit from their suffering." The standoff continued through the night as lawyers worked desperately to file injunctions and appeals while the community maintained its protective vigil around the school. Children who had spent their lives running had chosen to make their stand in this unlikely fortress, defended by adults who had finally found the courage to say, "Enough." But federal power carried weight that local resistance could not long withstand. As dawn broke on the third day, Crawford's reinforcements arrived. Additional marshals, federal judges with emergency jurisdiction, and officials from the departments of labor and education who carried authority that superseded any local objections. The final confrontation was set in motion when Crawford presented Sarah with an ultimatum: surrender the children listed in his warrants within 1 hour, or face immediate arrest on federal charges that carried sentences of up to 10 years in prison. As Sarah stood in the schoolhouse that had become her life's work, surrounded by children who looked to her for protection she might not be able to provide, she realized that some battles could only be won by refusing to surrender, regardless of the personal cost. 1 hour, she repeated quietly, looking into the faces of children who had already endured more trauma than any human being should experience. Then we'll give Marshal Crawford our answer. The clock on the schoolhouse wall ticked toward the calendar deadline that would determine whether love could triumph over law, whether community solidarity could overcome federal authority, and whether children who had found their voices would be forced back into silence. In that hour, 6 children who had hidden in a cave would discover whether the sanctuary they had built could withstand the full power of a system determined to reclaim them. And a woman who had come west seeking security would learn whether the most important battles were won not through compliance, but through the courage to stand firm when everything you care about hangs in the balance. The clock's minute hand moved with agonizing slowness as Sarah sat surrounded by the children who had become her world. 53 minutes remained until Marshal Crawford's ultimatum expired. 53 minutes to find a miracle, or watch everything they had built together crumble under the weight of federal authority. But in those final moments before what seemed like inevitable defeat, something extraordinary happened that would transform not just their immediate situation, but the entire national conversation about children's rights. Thomas Bradley burst through the schoolhouse door, his hair disheveled and his clothes bearing the dust of hard travel, but his eyes blazing with excitement that immediately electrified the room. "Sarah," he called breathlessly, waving a telegram above his head. "Emergency injunction from the Federal Circuit Court in Denver. Judge Morrison's closure order has been overturned pending full investigation." The words hit the assembled group like lightning, but Bradley wasn't finished. "More importantly," he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "Senator Margaret Whitfield is en route from Washington with a full congressional delegation. She's demanding a federal investigation into child labor practices. And she specifically cited your school as evidence that alternatives to institutional exploitation exist. Senator Whitfield. Sarah had read about the pioneering legislator from Massachusetts, the first woman to chair a Senate subcommittee and a fierce advocate for labor reform. If she was coming to Nebraska, it meant their local battle had attracted national attention. How? Sarah asked, still struggling to process this unexpected development. Bradley's grin widened as he gestured toward Lucy, who stood quietly near. The window with her characteristic modesty, despite having just changed the course of history. Lucy's documents reached more than just our local courts, Bradley explained. One of my colleagues in Denver has contacts with journalists in New York. Those photographs, those work schedules, those medical records, they're being published in newspapers across the country as we speak. The headline in the New York Herald this morning reads, "Child Slavery Exposed. Nebraska Teacher Reveals National Scandal." The implications were staggering. What had begun as a desperate attempt to protect 6 hidden children had become a catalyst for national reform. The evidence Lucy had courageously preserved was now exposing similar institutions from coast to coast. Through the schoolhouse windows, Sarah could see the immediate effects of this development. Marshall Crawford was engaged in heated conversation with his superiors via telegraph, his confident demeanor replaced by obvious uncertainty. Federal officials who had arrived with clear orders were now receiving contradictory instructions from Washington. But the most remarkable change was in the children themselves. For the first time since Sarah had known them, they were not preparing for flight or hiding. Instead, they were gathering around the lawyers and journalists who had begun arriving, sharing their stories with voices that grew stronger with each telling. Emma stood before a reporter from the Denver Post, her small frame somehow commanding attention as she described the survival techniques that had kept them alive in Jonathan Whitmore's cave. "We learned to live on almost nothing," she said simply. "We learned to move without making sound, to hide when we sensed danger, to take care of each other when no one else would. But most importantly, we learned that running away isn't the same as running toward something." The twins, Michael and Matthew, demonstrated their unique problem-solving methods for an educational reformer from Chicago, showing how their forced separation had paradoxically strengthened their ability to think as a unified system. "They tried to break our connection," Michael explained, while Matthew simultaneously worked on a different aspect of the same mathematical problem. "But thinking together made us stronger, not weaker." Lucy's storytelling gift proved invaluable, as she helped other newly arrived children articulate experiences they had never been able to voice. Her tales transformed trauma into narrative, giving shape and meaning to suffering that had previously seemed random and senseless. David, still largely nonverbal but increasingly confident, demonstrated his mechanical abilities by repairing a journalist's broken pocket watch while the man interviewed other children. The reporter's amazement at the 6-year-old's skill became part of his story about the extraordinary capabilities these institutions had wasted. Even tiny Rebecca, who still spoke primarily in whispers, charmed visitors with her songs and drawings. Her wordless communication had evolved into a form of art that spoke to hearts in ways that speeches and arguments could not match. Senator Whitfield arrived just as Marshall Crawford's hour was expiring, her small entourage creating a dramatic counterpoint to the federal enforcement team. At 62, she carried herself with the authority of someone who had spent decades fighting entrenched power, but her eyes softened immediately when she saw the children. "So," she said to Sarah without preamble, "you're the woman who started a revolution by refusing to abandon 6 children." "I'm the woman who couldn't bear to see children treated as property," Sarah replied, finding strength in the simplicity of truth. Senator Whitfield's meeting with Marshall Crawford was brief but decisive. Armed with emergency legislation that had been rushed through Congress in response to the national outcry, she informed the marshal that all enforcement actions were suspended, pending comprehensive federal investigation. Marshall Crawford, she announced publicly, standing on the schoolhouse steps before the assembled crowd. The children in this facility are now under federal protection as witnesses in a criminal investigation into systematic violations of child labor laws. Any attempt to remove them will be considered obstruction of justice. The reversal was so complete, so sudden, that Sarah felt almost dizzy with relief. But Senator Whitfield's next words made clear that their victory came with new responsibilities. Mrs. Montgomery, the senator continued, Congress is prepared to fund your innovative educational program as a model for similar institutions nationwide. But we need your children's testimony, your methods documented, your success replicated. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny and responsibility? Sarah looked around at the faces of children who had hidden in a cave just months earlier, now standing confidently before national leaders and journalists. They had journeyed from silence to voice, from isolation to community, from fear to courage. We're ready, she said simply. The weeks that followed transformed Millbrook into an unlikely center of national attention. Congressional hearings were held in the town hall, with senators and representatives traveling from Washington to hear testimony that would reshape American law. Emma's quiet description of institutional conditions moved seasoned politicians to tears. Lucy's preserved evidence became the foundation for criminal prosecutions that would eventually shut down dozens of exploitative facilities. The twins' innovative learning methods were studied by educators seeking alternatives to rigid institutional approaches, but perhaps most importantly, other communities began establishing similar schools, creating a network of sanctuaries for children who had been abandoned by conventional systems. The Riverside Industrial School, where most of Sarah's children had suffered, became the subject of a federal raid that liberated nearly 200 children and resulted in criminal charges against its administrators. Marcus Fleming, who had first tried to reclaim the children, was arrested for conspiracy to commit fraud and violation of federal labor laws. The transformation wasn't limited to legal and institutional changes. The children themselves continued evolving in ways that amazed everyone who worked with them. Emma discovered a gift for training other adults in trauma-informed education, her insights helping teachers across the country understand how to reach children who had been written off as hopeless cases. Lucy's stories were compiled into a book that became required reading in teacher training programs, her narratives providing windows into experiences that academic texts could not adequately describe. The twins developed mathematical teaching methods that were adopted by schools serving immigrant children and others whose educational backgrounds had been interrupted by trauma. David's mechanical abilities evolved into genuine engineering talent, his intuitive understanding of systems, leading to innovations in adaptive technologies for children with disabilities. Rebecca's artistic communication techniques became the foundation for new therapeutic approaches, her wordless songs and drawings providing healing pathways for children who could not yet speak their pain. As winter settled over Nebraska, Sarah stood in the expanded schoolhouse that now served children from across the Great Plains. The single room had grown into a complex of buildings, but the heart remained the same, a place where broken things could be made whole, where silence could become voice, where children who had been discarded could discover their own immeasurable worth. The mail-order marriage she had planned seemed like a dream from another life. The security she had sought in domesticity paled beside the purpose she had found in protecting the vulnerable. She had come west as a woman fleeing the wreckage of her past and had become a pioneer of hope for children whose futures had seemed impossible. Emma approached as Sarah stood watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, the same colors that had greeted her arrival in Nebraska all those months ago. "Are you happy?" Emma asked with the directness that had never left her despite all the changes. Sarah considered the question seriously. Happiness seemed too small a word for what she felt. She had found something larger than personal contentment, a sense of rightness of being exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. "I'm home," she said finally, and realized that was the truest answer she could give. Around them, children who had once hidden in darkness were playing in the last light of day, their laughter carrying across the prairie like a promise that tomorrow would be better than today. They had rebuilt their lives from nothing, but in doing so, they had built something that would outlast them all, proof that love could triumph over exploitation, that community could overcome indifference, and that the smallest voices could change the world when someone was finally brave enough to listen. The federal agents who had come to destroy their sanctuary had become witnesses to its transformation into something that would protect countless other children. The system that had tried to reclaim them as property had been forced to recognize them as people deserving of dignity, protection, and hope. In learning to save 6 silent children, Sarah had discovered how to give voice to thousands more who were still waiting in the darkness for someone to find them, to protect them, to tell them that they mattered. The revolution that had begun in a cave dwelling in Nebraska would continue spreading, one rescued child at a time, until no child would ever again have to choose between exploitation and hiding. The greatest mail order romance of all had turned out to be the love affair between a teacher and her calling, between children and their futures, between a community and its conscience. And like all true love stories, it was just the beginning. Spring arrived in Nebraska with an explosion of wildflowers that transformed the prairie into a canvas of purple, yellow, and white stretching to the horizon. For Sarah, standing in the doorway of what had once been a simple schoolhouse and was now the headquarters of the National Center for Trauma-Informed Education, the blooming landscape felt like a metaphor for everything that had grown from those desperate early days. 18 months had passed since Senator Whitfield's intervention, and the changes extended far beyond the physical expansion of buildings and programs. The children who had once communicated in whispers and survival gestures were now traveling across the country, sharing their expertise with educators, government officials, and other survivors who were just beginning their own journeys toward healing. But success had brought unexpected challenges that tested Sarah's ability to balance growth with the intimate care that remained at the heart of their mission. The federal funding that had saved their program came with bureaucratic requirements that sometimes threatened to transform their innovative approaches into standardized procedures. Mrs. Montgomery called Dr. Patricia Hutchinson, the federal education coordinator who had been assigned to oversee their expanding operations. "The Department of Education needs documentation of your teaching methodologies for the quarterly report. The Congressional Oversight Committee requires detailed metrics on student progress and institutional outcomes." Sarah suppressed a sigh as she reviewed the stack of forms and reports that seemed to multiply weekly. Government support was a blessing, but it came with demands for quantification that sometimes missed the essential humanity of their work. "Dr. Hutchinson," Sarah replied diplomatically, "how do you measure a child's transition from terror to trust? How do you quantify the moment when someone who has been silent for years finds their voice?" The question highlighted a fundamental tension that had emerged as their local experiment became a national model. Government officials needed statistics and standardized outcomes to justify continued funding. But the children's healing couldn't be reduced to numbers on bureaucratic charts. This conflict came to a head when Emma, now 13 and serving as the center's first student liaison coordinator, was invited to testify before a Senate subcommittee about the effectiveness of their programs. What should have been a triumph became a crisis when federal officials insisted that her testimony be pre-approved and scripted to highlight specific policy objectives. "They want me to say what supports their agenda," Emma explained to Sarah, with the analytical clarity that had always marked her thinking. "But that's not the truth. The truth is messier, more complicated. Some children heal quickly, some take years, some may never fully recover. If I only tell them the success stories, I'm not helping the children who are still struggling." Sarah found herself facing a dilemma that went to the heart of everything they had built. Compromise with federal requirements and risk losing the authenticity that made their program effective, or maintain their principles and potentially lose the support that allowed them to help thousands of children. The answer came from an unexpected source, the children themselves, who had developed their own network of communication and mutual support that transcended institutional boundaries. Through letters, visits, and an informal system of mentorship, the children who had graduated from Sarah's program were staying connected with current students and establishing similar centers in other communities. They had created something that no federal program could duplicate, a peer-to-peer support system based on shared experience and genuine understanding. Lucy had become the unofficial historian of this movement, corresponding with children across the country and documenting their stories in what would eventually become a comprehensive record of childhood trauma and recovery in industrial America. Her letters revealed patterns of institutional abuse that helped other communities identify and shut down exploitative operations. The twins, Michael and Matthew, had taken their collaborative learning methods to immigrant communities in Chicago, where their techniques proved invaluable for children whose education had been interrupted by displacement and cultural shock. Their approach to treating learning as partnership rather than competition resonated with children from cultures that valued collective achievement. David's mechanical talents had evolved into a passion for creating adaptive technologies that helped children with various disabilities participate fully in educational and social activities. His workshop behind the main school building had become a laboratory where theoretical innovation met practical application. Rebecca, now 7 and increasingly verbal, had become a bridge between the children who were still primarily nonverbal and the adults who struggled to understand their needs. Her combination of spoken language and artistic communication provided translation services that no trained professional could match. But it was Emma's evolution into a young leader that most clearly demonstrated the transformation their program could achieve. When federal officials demanded scripted testimony, she proposed an alternative that would satisfy their requirements while maintaining the integrity of her message. "I'll tell them exactly what they need to hear," Emma announced at a staff meeting. "But I'll tell them in my own words, with my own examples, in a way that serves the children rather than the bureaucracy." Her testimony before the Senate subcommittee became a masterpiece of young advocacy that balanced political necessity with passionate truth-telling. Speaking with confidence that would have been impossible during her silent years, Emma painted a picture of institutional possibilities that inspired both lawmakers and the national audience watching via newspaper coverage. "Senators," she began, standing before the intimidating committee room with poise that belie her age, "I am here not just as a survivor of the system you're investigating, but as proof that alternatives exist. 3 years ago, I was a frightened child hiding in a cave, convinced that all adults were threats to be avoided. Today, I stand before you as an advocate for children who are still hiding, still afraid, still convinced that no one cares enough to protect them." Her testimony wove together personal narrative with policy recommendations, individual stories with systemic analysis. She spoke of survival techniques learned in desperate circumstances and how those same skills could be channeled into healing practices. She described the difference between compliance achieved through fear and cooperation built on trust. Most importantly, she challenged the senators to look beyond institutional convenience toward genuine child welfare. "You can measure our program success in graduation rates and test scores if that's what your reports require," Emma told the committee. "But the real measure is whether children who have been discarded by society discover that they have value, whether children who have been silenced find their voices, whether children who have been convinced they are worthless learn that they matter." The impact of her testimony extended far beyond the hearing room. Newspapers across the country published excerpts. Editorial writers praised her eloquence. and other young survivors began writing to senators and representatives with their own stories and recommendations. More importantly, Emma's example inspired other children in the program to find their own voices as advocates. What had begun as a single testimony became a movement of young people who refused to be defined by their trauma and instead used their experiences to create change. The federal response was everything Sarah could have hoped for. Rather than imposing standardized requirements that would have diluted their approach, congressional leaders authorized a new category of educational funding specifically designed for innovative trauma-informed programs. The legislation required regular evaluation but allowed for flexibility in methods and outcomes measurement. Sarah found herself appointed to a federal advisory committee charged with developing guidelines for institutions serving children who had experienced exploitation or abuse. The irony wasn't lost on her. The mail-order bride, who had sought security in domestic obscurity, was now helping to shape national policy from the highest levels of government. But perhaps the most significant development was the emergence of a new generation of educators who had been trained in their methods and were establishing similar programs in communities across the country. These weren't federally mandated replications, but organic initiatives led by people who understood that children's healing required approaches that honored their individual needs and experiences. Sarah received reports weekly from these new centers. A former mill town in Massachusetts where immigrant children were learning to trust again. A mining community in Colorado where children orphaned by industrial accidents were discovering their own capabilities. A farming region in Kansas where children from failed homesteads were building new forms of family and community. Each program adapted their basic principles to local needs and circumstances, but all shared the fundamental conviction that children were individuals deserving of respect rather than raw material for institutional processing. The network that was emerging operated on principles of mutual support and shared learning rather than hierarchical control. As summer arrived and the center prepared for its annual celebration of student achievements, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. The 6 children she had found hiding in a cave had become leaders of a national movement that was transforming how America thought about childhood, education, and the responsibility of communities to protect their most vulnerable members. Emma approached as Sarah stood watching the preparations, her arms full of letters from children around the country who would be represented at the celebration, even though they couldn't attend in person. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had just taken the next stagecoach back to Chicago? Emma asked with the teasing affection that had replaced her early wariness. Sarah considered the question seriously. That frightened woman who had stepped off the stagecoach in Millbrook seemed like a stranger now, someone whose dreams had been limited by circumstances rather than expanded by possibilities. I think I would have spent my life wondering what I had missed, Sarah replied. I would have been safe, but I wouldn't have been home. Around them, children who had once known only exploitation were planning lessons they would teach, stories they would share, innovations they would demonstrate. They had become not just survivors but pioneers, proving that the human capacity for healing and growth could triumph over even the most systematic attempts to crush the spirit. The mail-order bride who had come seeking a husband had instead found a calling that fulfilled her in ways no conventional marriage could have achieved. She had discovered that the greatest security came not from being protected by others, but from being strong enough to protect those who needed shelter from the world's cruelties. As evening fell over the Nebraska prairie, Sarah looked toward the horizon where other communities were building their own versions of sanctuary, and she knew that the work was far from finished. There were still children hiding in dark places, still systems that profited from exploitation, still adults who needed to be reminded that every child deserved the chance to discover their own worth. But there were also more voices speaking for the voiceless, more hands reaching out to lift up the fallen, more communities choosing courage over convenience. The revolution that had begun with 6 silent children in a cave was spreading across the continent. One rescued child at a time, one converted heart at a time, one community at a time. The seeds of change had been planted in the most unlikely soil and were now blooming into a forest of hope that would shelter generations of children yet to come. The telegram that arrived on a crisp October morning 3 years after their national triumph carried news that would test everything Sarah and her children had built together. The message was brief but devastating. Fire at Chicago facility. 17 children missing. Suspected arson. Requesting immediate assistance. Director Walsh, Midwest Center for Child Welfare. Sarah read the words twice before their full implications registered. The Chicago Center was one of the most successful programs modeled on their Nebraska approach, serving children who had escaped from industrial exploitation throughout the Great Lakes region. If someone was targeting these facilities, it meant their entire network was under attack. Emma, now 15 and serving as the training coordinator for new staff across multiple states, appeared at Sarah's shoulder as if sensing crisis. The years had transformed her from a frightened child into a young woman whose wisdom often exceeded that of adults twice her age. But the telegram brought back the familiar tension of those who had learned to recognize danger. "It's starting again, isn't it?" Emma asked quietly. "Someone wants to shut us down." Before Sarah could respond, Thomas Bradley burst through the office door, his face grim with news that confirmed her worst fears. The young lawyer who had defended them in their early battles was now a federal prosecutor specializing in child welfare crimes, and his expression carried the weight of official intelligence. "It's not random," Bradley announced without preamble. "We've identified a pattern of attacks on trauma-informed education facilities across 7 states. Someone is systematically targeting programs that serve children who have escaped from industrial exploitation." Sarah felt the familiar chill of institutional threat, but this time the danger was different. They were no longer fighting to protect a handful of hidden children. They were defending a movement that threatened powerful interests across multiple industries. "Who?" Sarah asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. "Consortium of industrial operators who've lost their workforce to programs like yours," Bradley replied grimly. "They're calling it the Productivity Protection Alliance, but it's essentially a coalition of businesses that profit from child labor. They've hired private investigators, legal teams, and apparently some people willing to use more direct methods." The scope of the threat became clearer as reports arrived. Throughout the day, the Chicago fire was the most serious incident, but there had been other attacks, suspicious accidents at facilities in Ohio, legal challenges filed simultaneously in multiple states, and intimidation campaigns targeting families who had sought help from the trauma centers. Most disturbing of all was evidence that the consortium had infiltrated some government agencies, using their influence to restrict funding and impose regulations designed to cripple the innovative programs. "They're patient," Bradley explained as he spread intelligence reports across Sarah's desk. "They understand they can't attack us directly without generating public sympathy. Instead, they're using bureaucratic pressure, economic manipulation, and selective violence to make these programs too expensive and dangerous to maintain." The strategy was diabolically effective. Several smaller centers had already closed after facing impossible insurance premiums and regulatory challenges. Others were struggling with staff departures as educators faced personal threats. The network that had grown organically through shared commitment was being systematically dismantled by organized opposition. But as Sarah absorbed the magnitude of the threat, she realized that their enemies had made a crucial miscalculation. They were applying industrial thinking to a movement that operated on entirely different principles. The children who had once been their victims were now their most formidable opponents. The response began immediately, organized not by adults, but by the young people who had graduated from the trauma programs and were now working in communities across the country. Emma coordinated communication through a network that combined official channels with the informal survival systems the children had developed during their years of hiding. Lucy, now 16 and working as a journalist for Reform Publications, began investigating the Productivity Protection Alliance with the tenacity of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. Her articles exposed the connections between industrial operators and the politicians who supported restrictive regulations. The twins, Michael and Matthew, who had established a teacher training program in Chicago, organized the evacuation and temporary placement of children from the burned facility with military precision. Their experience in collaborative problem-solving proved invaluable in managing complex logistics under pressure. David, now 11 and recognized as a prodigy in mechanical engineering, began developing security innovations that would protect the centers without creating the institutional atmosphere that had characterized the places from which they had all escaped. Rebecca, 10 years old and increasingly confident in both verbal and artistic communication, created a series of drawings and songs that told the story of the attacks in ways that resonated with public sentiment. Her work appeared in newspapers and was performed at rallies supporting the trauma centers, but it was Emma's strategic thinking that provided the framework for their counterattack. She proposed something that neither Sarah nor the adult advisors had considered. Rather than defending individual centers, they would demonstrate their effectiveness by creating new ones faster than their enemies could destroy them. They think this is about buildings and funding, Emma explained to a gathering of center directors and government officials. But it's not. It's about knowledge and commitment. Every child we've helped can help other children. Every community that's seen our work can replicate it. They can't burn down an idea whose time has come. The plan that emerged was ambitious beyond anything they had previously attempted. Instead of waiting for formal approval and federal funding, they would establish emergency centers wherever children needed them, using whatever resources were available and adapting their methods to local conditions. The first test came in Chicago, where the destroyed center needed immediate replacement. Rather than rebuilding a single facility, Emma and the twins organized the creation of 5 smaller programs hosted by churches, community centers, and private homes throughout the city. Each program served fewer children but could operate with minimal overhead and maximum flexibility. The distributed approach proved remarkably effective. When consortium agents tried to intimidate host families, they found themselves facing entire neighborhoods that had rallied to protect the children. When bureaucratic obstacles were erected, the program simply moved to different locations or modified their approaches to avoid regulatory triggers. More importantly, the emergency response revealed the depth of public support that had developed for their work. Families who had never directly benefited from the trauma centers volunteered space and resources. Teachers who had been trained in their methods organized informal networks. Communities that had witnessed the transformation of local children demanded protection for the programs. The consortium's response escalated accordingly. Private investigators began targeting Sarah personally, seeking evidence of financial impropriety or professional misconduct that could be used to discredit the entire movement. Legal challenges were filed questioning her qualifications and demanding audits of every center that used her methods. The pressure intensified when consortium representatives approached government officials with offers of campaign contributions and industrial development projects in exchange for support of restrictive legislation. Several senators who had previously supported trauma-informed education began distancing themselves from the programs. Sarah found herself facing the most serious challenge since the early days in Millbrook: whether to compromise her principles, to maintain political support, or risk losing federal backing by refusing to moderate her approach. The decision was made for her when consortium agents made a crucial error. In their desperation to find damaging information, they targeted the children directly, attempting to bribe or intimidate former students into providing testimony against the centers. The attempt backfired spectacularly. Children who had learned to recognize exploitation immediately identified the agent's true purpose and began documenting their approaches. Within weeks, Lucy's investigative reporting had exposed the consortium's methods with evidence that no amount of political influence could suppress. The public reaction was swift and overwhelming. Newspapers across the country published editorials condemning the targeting of child witnesses. Religious leaders organized prayer services supporting the trauma centers. Labor unions, recognizing the threat to their own organizing efforts, provided financial and legal support. Most significantly, the children themselves took control of the narrative in ways that no adult opposition could counter. Emma organized a national speaking tour featuring graduates from trauma centers across the country. Their testimony about both their past exploitation and their current achievements created a moral clarity that transcended political calculation. The tour culminated in a massive rally in Washington, D.C., where thousands of supporters gathered to demand federal protection for trauma-informed education programs. The event was organized entirely by young people who had graduated from the centers, demonstrating their capacity for leadership that their former exploiters had tried to deny. Standing before the crowd, Emma delivered what many observers called the most powerful speech of the child welfare reform movement. Her words combined personal testimony with policy analysis, individual experience with systemic understanding. "They want you to believe that children are property," she declared, her voice carrying clearly across the vast assembly. "That we exist to serve their economic interests rather than our own human potential. But we are living proof that children are not raw materials for industrial processing. We are individuals with minds, hearts, and souls that deserve respect and protection." The speech was broadcast by radio stations across the country and published in full by major newspapers. Its impact on public opinion was immediate and decisive. Politicians who had been wavering in their support found themselves facing overwhelming pressure from constituents who demanded action. Within a month, Congress passed the most comprehensive child welfare legislation in American history, including federal protections for trauma-informed education programs and criminal penalties for anyone who threatened children seeking help from approved centers. The consortium's campaign collapsed as quickly as it had emerged. Industrial operators who had funded the attacks found themselves facing federal investigations and boycotts organized by communities that had embraced the trauma centers. Several prominent members were arrested on charges ranging from witness intimidation to conspiracy to commit arson, but perhaps the most significant victory was what the crisis had revealed about the movement Sarah and her children had created. Under pressure, it had not fragmented or retreated. Instead, it had grown stronger, more creative, and more resilient. The emergency response had demonstrated that their work no longer depended on any single institution or funding source. It had become a living network of relationships and knowledge that could adapt to any challenge and survive any attack. As autumn turned to winter and the immediate crisis passed, Sarah reflected on how far they had all traveled from those desperate early days when 6 children had hidden in a cave. Convinced that survival required invisibility, now those same children were leaders of a national movement that had transformed how America thought about childhood, education, and the responsibility of communities to protect their most vulnerable members. They had not only survived their own trauma, but had used their experience to prevent countless other children from suffering similar exploitation. The mail-order bride, who had sought security in marriage, had instead found purpose in a calling that demanded constant courage. But as she watched Emma and the others planning new initiatives and training new educators, Sarah knew that the work would continue long after she was gone. They had planted seeds of change that would grow for generations, each rescued child becoming a protector of others, each healed heart becoming a source of healing for those still suffering. The revolution that had begun with 6 silent children in a cave dwelling had become a force that no amount of organized opposition could destroy. 25 years had passed since Sarah Montgomery first stepped off that dusty stagecoach in Millbrook, and the Nebraska morning that greeted her now bore little resemblance to the desolate frontier settlement she had once encountered. The town had grown into a thriving center of educational innovation, its tree-lined streets bustling with visitors from around the world who came to study the methods that had revolutionized approaches to childhood trauma recovery. But it was not the physical transformation that moved Sarah most deeply as she stood in the garden behind what was now called the Emma Hartwell Center for Child Advocacy. It was the circle of young faces gathered around her 12 new arrivals who had been brought to safety just the previous week, their eyes holding the same mixture of wariness and desperate hope that had once characterized 6 children hiding in a cave. At 53, Sarah carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades proving that love could triumph over institutional indifference. Her hair was silver now, and lines around her eyes spoke of countless nights spent comforting frightened children. But her voice remained as gentle as it had been when she first called into that limestone cave so many years ago. The most important thing to understand, she was telling the newest arrivals, is that your past does not define your future. What happened to you is wrong, but it doesn't determine what you can become. Among the children listening was 7-year-old Marcus, recently rescued from a textile mill in Alabama, where children as young as 5 had been forced to work 14-hour shifts. His small hands bore scars from machinery that had never been designed for child operation, but his eyes held an intelligence that no amount of exploitation had been able to crush. Beside him sat 12-year-old Elena, who had fled from domestic servitude in a mansion where she had been treated as property rather than a human being. Her Spanish was fluent, but her English came in whispers, each word carefully chosen as if speaking too loudly might bring punishment. The twins, Isabella and Sophia, age 9, had been part of a traveling circus where children were trained through fear and violence to perform dangerous acts for public entertainment. They communicated primarily through glances and gestures, their shared trauma creating a bond that paralleled what Sarah had once observed in Michael and Matthew. These new arrivals represented the evolution of child exploitation as the original industrial schemes had been shut down. The methods had changed: domestic servitude, entertainment exploitation, agricultural labor disguised as family farming, but the fundamental cruelty remained constant. What had also remained constant was the effectiveness of the approach Sarah and her original children had pioneered. The center now operated programs in 43 states and 7 countries, each adapted to local conditions, but grounded in the same principles: children healing children, peer support transcending professional intervention, and education as liberation rather than control. The original 6 children, now adults, had never truly left. They had built their lives around extending the sanctuary they had found to others who needed the same protection and healing. Emma, at 40, served as the center's executive director and had become internationally recognized as the leading expert on trauma-informed child advocacy. Her own children, adopted from various rescue operations over the years, were now teenagers who helped train new staff and mentor newly arrived children with the natural skill that came from growing up in an environment where healing was the primary focus. Lucy had become a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist whose investigative work had exposed child exploitation networks on 4 continents. Her articles had led to the prosecution of hundreds of traffickers and the liberation of thousands of children. But she always returned to Nebraska for the annual gathering that celebrated each year's rescued children. Michael and Matthew, now 38, had established a network of educational innovation labs where their collaborative learning methods were taught to teachers worldwide. Their approach to treating intelligence as collective rather than individual had influenced everything from corporate training programs to international diplomacy. David's mechanical genius had evolved into groundbreaking work in assistive technology. His innovations had helped disabled children around the world access education and opportunities that would otherwise have been denied to them. His workshop, still located behind the main center building, was now a research facility that attracted engineers and inventors from major universities. Rebecca, 35 and the mother of 3, had become a pioneering researcher in nonverbal communication therapy. Her childhood experience of expressing complex thoughts through art and song had evolved into techniques that helped children who had been rendered mute by trauma find their voices again. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of their continued involvement was how naturally they had adapted to roles as mentors and guides for each new generation of arrivals. They understood the language of survival in ways that no amount of professional training could teach, and they could reach children who had given up on trusting adults. This morning's gathering was special because it marked not just another group of new arrivals, but the culmination of a project that had been 25 years in the making. The establishment of a permanent international treaty protecting children from industrial exploitation. The ceremony would take place that afternoon in the center's main hall, where representatives from 37 nations would sign the Children's Liberation Accord legislation, directly inspired by the evidence and advocacy that had begun with 6 children hiding in a Nebraska cave. "Mrs. Sarah," Marcus asked quietly, using the title that had become standard among the children, "will the treaty really stop bad people from hurting kids like us?" Sarah knelt down to meet his eyes directly, a gesture that had become second nature. Over the decades, "Marcus, no single law can stop all cruelty. But each law makes it harder for cruel people to operate, and each rescued child becomes someone who can help rescue others. The treaty is important, but you and the friends you'll make here, you're the real protection for children who are still hiding." The truth of this statement was evident in the statistics that Emma would present during the afternoon ceremony. The network of trauma-informed centers had directly rescued over 50,000 children from various forms of exploitation. But more significantly, those rescued children had gone on to become advocates, educators, social workers, journalists, and lawmakers who had transformed how governments and communities responded to child welfare. The ripple effects were immeasurable. Children who had been written off as damaged goods had become leaders of their communities. Survival skills learned in desperate circumstances had been channeled into innovations that benefited society as a whole. The voiceless had found their voices and used them to speak for those who were still silenced. As the afternoon ceremony began, Sarah found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The frightened woman who had fled Chicago seeking security in marriage seemed like a character from someone else's story. The desperate children who had survived on hope and determination in a limestone cave had become the founders of a movement that spanned continents. President Theodore Roosevelt himself delivered the keynote address, his words carrying the weight of federal commitment to the principles that had emerged from Sarah's small Nebraska schoolhouse. The Children's Liberation Accord represents more than international law, the president declared to the assembled delegates and media representatives. It represents a fundamental shift in how civilization treats its most vulnerable members. We are here today because a handful of brave children and one remarkable woman proved that love is stronger than exploitation, that healing is possible, even after the deepest trauma, and that the smallest voices can change the world when someone is finally brave enough to listen. Emma's presentation of the treaty's key provisions was met with sustained applause as she outlined protections that would have seemed impossible when she first emerged from hiding 25 years earlier. Criminal penalties for child trafficking, international cooperation in prosecution of exploiters, mandatory education funding for trauma recovery programs, and recognition of children's rights to safety, education, and protection from economic exploitation. But the most powerful moment came when Emma invited some of the newest arrivals to share their hopes for the future. 7-year-old Marcus stood on a chair to reach the microphone, his small voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium. "I want to learn to read," he said simply. "And when I grow up, I want to help other kids learn to read too. Because Mrs. Sarah says that when you can read, you can learn anything. And when you can learn anything, nobody can keep you small anymore." The standing ovation that followed lasted for several minutes, but Sarah noticed that the applause came not just from the dignitaries and officials in attendance. The children themselves, hundreds of them now, representing every continent and dozens of languages, were clapping with the enthusiasm of those who recognized their own stories in Marcus's simple declaration. As evening fell and the official ceremonies concluded, Sarah walked through the center's expanded grounds with Emma, observing the daily routines that had become as natural as breathing. Children helping children, laughter echoing from dormitories and classrooms, the quiet conversations of young people planning futures that would have been impossible in their previous circumstances. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had just taken that return stagecoach to Chicago? Emma asked, echoing a question she had posed years earlier. Sarah considered the question more seriously this time, thinking about the woman she might have become, the conventional life she might have led, the security she might have found in traditional domesticity. "I think I would have spent my life wondering what I was missing," she replied finally. "I would have been safe, but I wouldn't have been alive in the way that matters most." They paused beside the memorial garden where photographs and stories of children who hadn't survived their exploitation were displayed, alongside tributes to the adults who had given their lives to protect the vulnerable. It was a reminder that their victories had come at a cost, that not every story had ended in rescue and healing, but surrounding the memorial were dozens of new plantings, each one representing a child who had been saved, who was growing toward a future that would have been impossible without the intervention of people who cared enough to act. "The work isn't finished," Emma observed, looking toward the horizon where other communities were building their own versions of sanctuary. "It never will be," Sarah agreed. "But that's not a burden, it's a promise. Every child we help becomes someone who can help others. Every heart we heal becomes a source of healing for those who are still suffering." As stars appeared in the Nebraska sky, Sarah felt the deep satisfaction that came from a life spent in service to something larger than personal ambition. The mail-order marriage she had sought had been impossible, but she had found something infinitely more valuable, a family that included thousands of children who called her mother, a purpose that had transformed not just individual lives but the entire structure of how society protected its youngest members. The 6 children who had once hidden in darkness were now leaders of light who had illuminated the way for countless others. The revolution they had begun with whispered words in a limestone cave had become a worldwide movement that continued spreading, one rescued child at a time, one converted heart at a time, one community at a time. In choosing to answer the cry of 6 silent children, Sarah had discovered that the greatest adventures began not with careful planning, but with the courage to say yes when love called for action. The cave dwelling had been left behind long ago, but its lessons lived on in every child who learned that hiding was not the only option, that healing was possible, and that the future could be different from the past when someone cared enough to make it so. The story that had begun with loss and fear had become a testament to the transformative power of compassion, proof that the smallest acts of courage could reshape the world, and evidence that true security came not from protecting yourself, but from being strong enough to protect those who could not protect themselves. As Sarah walked back toward the lights of the center, she could hear the gentle sounds of children settling into safety for another night, voices that had been silenced now singing lullabies, hearts that had been broken now beating with hope, spirits that had been crushed now soaring toward dreams that finally seemed possible. The mail-order bride had found her true calling, The silent children had discovered their voices, and together they had built something that would shelter and heal generations yet to come. In a world that often seemed determined to destroy innocence, they had created an enduring sanctuary where the youngest and most vulnerable could remember what it felt like to be cherished, protected, and believed in. And in that sanctuary, the revolution of love continued, one gentle word at a time, one rescued child at a time, one transformed life at a time, forever and always. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.